So hello and welcome to another live edition of the Thinking Deeply About Primary Education podcast inside the minds of some truly inspirational teachers. Now tonight I'm joined once again by Amy Bills, Deputy CEO of the Multi-Academy Trust and the mastermind behind this much anticipated education book club. Hi Amy, how are you? Sorry Amy. Had you on mute there. How are you Amy, all right?
Hello, I'm good, thank you.
So the focus of tonight's stream will be the 5 lessons Amy and her teachers took from Lekha Sharma's curriculum to classroom. But feel free to ask questions in the chat, share your opinions, support each other. I think that's what it's there for. Now, Amy, you discussed your education book club in episode 31 of TDaPE, but for anyone who hasn't caught that episode, what have you put in place for the teachers across your trust?
Yeah, so it's really exciting for us this year. So it's the first year that we've tried something like this. So I think the purpose really is one of the joys of being part of a MAT is you get that collective capacity, and you can really I think you can really succeed with that, with particular focus on CPD. There are a lot of things that won't work everywhere, but I think one of the things that we've been able to put in place is the things that we know work can be shared and discussed everywhere. So a core set of texts in each school that will help us establish some models of excellence across all different areas of our practice, across the curriculum, looking at inclusion, looking at leadership. This year curated by me, just based on what we know are kind of best bets from research, high quality authors. But again, over time, maybe that's something that as that evolves, other colleagues can contribute to the curation of. And those texts are then woven throughout our CPD curriculum across the year. So they're not just a standalone pretty book to go on a shelf, although some of them do look particularly lovely. They'll be used, they'll be loved, and they will be really, really kind of talked through all year. So a great example would be Thinking Deeply About Primary Maths. So it's in our book club, but it's also woven throughout the sessions for our maths leaders throughout the year.
So you've got a copy in each school in the trust, so all 19, but also you've got CPD that draws on particular parts. So I think last time we talked about language, I think was where we started, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So there'll be key chapters within each of the books as well. So we know language and vocabulary is a massive focus for us nationally, certainly for our schools, children and teachers. So we'll look at, the language chapters in the particular books. So there's Thinking Deeply, there's Art and Science of Primary Reading. We're looking at language threaded across the curriculum, and then kind of bringing in those additional reference points. So work from the EEF, for example, work from Alex Quigley on pillars of vocabulary development, really supplementing, but really deliberately with that curriculum mindset.
Nice. So you've done quite a lot of work to put this together. It's not something you just decide to do overnight.
No, there's quite a lot of thought gone in, and it's brilliant. And people have been so generous with their time, with their expertise, both in terms of supporting us with actually getting the texts themselves and getting them into schools, personalising them for schools, but also giving time to come and join us actually, and to talk with colleagues about their work, about their kind of key principles underpinning each of the books. And just brings it to life for people a little bit more.
It sounds fantastic. I think definitely something that I reckon there'll be people listening. Certainly, if they weren't listening to episode 31, thinking, how can we replicate this in your or in their settings? And definitely, I think exploring a really careful sequence through what you can get from the books. I think that's definitely the thing that stands out to me. Is you're really you know exactly what you want your teachers to gain from it. So why this book?
So I love this book. I love it. It's so concise. It real packs a punch. It's tiny, but it's absolutely packed. It's brilliant. And I think it's so applicable to all colleagues in all roles, right from your early career teacher all the way through to subject senior leaders, head teachers, and the likes of me, who now are leading at an executive level and delivering support, challenge and CPD for colleagues who are leading. I've used it this morning to kind of polish up some subject leader training, for over the coming weeks. It's really, really practical, and it feels like a bit of a one-stop shop. So there's a kind of covers everything. So if I talk you through some of the chapters: curriculum, principles and infrastructure, reading, character education, the inclusive classroom, continuous improvement. It really is a real good starting point for everybody. And it was very deliberate as well, bringing it to very near the start of the academic year, because I think because it is a kind of a common denominator for everybody, regardless of role, it was a nice way in to start the book club, because it's an applicable one for all colleagues. Some of them are a little bit more nuanced across the year, but this one definitely is a winner for everybody.
And so you said it's not that long. How many pages do you reckon? Fewer than 300?
I'll tell you, 88.
Wow, so you just 4 cups of coffee, maybe?
Well, yeah.
5 cups of coffee.
And you read quicker with each cup, right? So it probably wouldn't take you quite that long.
Yeah, because mean, that's ideal for those who aren't necessarily in the habit of reading about education.
Exactly.
As much, that's an entryway. Before you say, for instance, read one of Craig Barton's books, which are sort of tomes and require a lot of effort, and not because of the content, but because of the length of them. Whereas if you aren't in the habit, something that easy could think, oh, actually, this is something I quite like doing.
Yeah, and what Lekha does really well is breaks it within the chapters, breaks that up and makes it really pithy. So there's little practical strategies at the end of each chapter, some key questions to think about. In a couple of the chapters, you get kind of an explanation and then a real deliberate, and what does this look like in the classroom? So it really chunks it really nicely. And I think one of the key benefits of my role is that I can do a lot of reading and curate that content and distill it a lot, because our colleagues in the classrooms just don't have the time, all the time to do that. But I think one of the things that can be really helpful, hopefully, in doing is signposting to key texts, but key parts of core texts as well. But no, this is a real handy, really concise guide.
And you focused on one chapter 5?
We did, yeah. Chapter 5, I think, and when we spoke with Lekha, I think it's quite a common one that people ask her to speak on. And as I say, we're using the book in a lot of ways throughout the year for subject leaders, look for a particular focus on inclusion for one session, for example. But this chapter is a real practical kind of hitting all the aspects of what you'd hope to see in a really effective classroom environment. So the chapter itself is broken up into 5 sections, hence the 5 key things that we've learned at this point. And that's because the book club's open to all colleagues in all roles, and it's brilliant because that will mean you get a real diverse range of attenders, and also we record the session so that colleagues can go back to them later on, or actually attend live and then revisit. The other aspect of the book club is that people will be attending, and some of them will have read the book in full. Some of them will have had a little skim through, but some folks might not have even picked it up yet. So it's really it felt like the best starting point as well to start the conversations around this book. So Lekha breaks it up into 5 sections, and she very kindly talked us through and invited questions from colleagues to each one of those.
And what sort of questions did your colleagues ask?
So this particular chapter, as I say, is really helpful because it breaks it up into talking through behaviour for learning, for example, and then unpicking what does that look like in the classroom. Lekha's roles to date have meant that she's a real breadth of experience, from classroom practitioner to curriculum designer with TDaPE. So there's a real kind of range of expertise and experience there that kind of she can shine a light on. And it was really interesting because we got some folks who were head teachers asking about, how would I spot if somebody needed support with that in particular, or, what would that feel like from classroom to classroom, walking across the school, right through to questions that might be more relevant for the career teachers, a strategy, for example, in terms of rules and routines. And Lekha talked about how actually real common, well-rehearsed routines can also help with retrieval. So, we were talking about, a classroom routine in transition from one lesson to another could be a brilliant time to practice some multiplication facts or whatever it might be as children are moving about the classroom. So a real diverse range, really. And she also sent very kindly some resources afterwards to help folks who'd asked for a particular resource in terms of some metacognition work that they've got particularly going on in their school. And Lekha was able to kind of link that to some of the tips in that chapter and support afterwards.
Nice. And so what were the 5 big takeaways? Maybe we take them one at a time and really go.
Yeah, okay. So the first point in this chapter is behaviour for learning. And throughout this whole chapter, Lekha really emphasises these are kind of fundamental foundations. They're not formulaic, they're not subject specific, but they're real core principles of curriculum to classroom. So in behaviour for learning, Lekha emphasises the importance of the combination of routines and regulation and relationships. And she talks about actually behaviour for learning, you get that buzz for learning, but it's absolutely rooted in consistency of routines, application and commitment to that from all adults in the classroom across the setting, that real consistency that we know is so important around behaviour, but how that can actually lead to a real buzz for learning. She talked about pupils being nurtured and cared for, but actually being nurtured as scholars. And I really liked that as an idea, that real thirst for knowledge and the need for routines and boundaries in order to facilitate that for our children.
Yes, it's almost the first thing you do before you can do anything else is you establish those routines and those norms. And so you said there's no formula to follow, but sort of general principles. What sort of things is she exploring when she discusses routines and norms and culture?
Yeah, so I mean, classroom routines, there's a little bit of a kind of, I think, a sort of tip of the hat to some TDaPE stuff in there, just around that absolute clarity and consistency for all children, so that actually you can establish a culture of error, you can establish a climate of positivity around learning, but real clarity around the routines. She uses a phrase, boundaries that flex just enough for laughter and joy and for those impromptu learning conversations. And one of the things that she really emphasizes is, the absolute importance of the consistency and routines, but actually some of the flex that you need around those learning conversations, like you say, can't happen without those routines being well firmly embedded.
Nice. So then what's the plan as a trust? Will head teachers take responsibility for sort of learning from this takeaway, or have you got in mind some sort of group that on which you sit and then work together as a trust, so to speak?
Yeah, so for this year, the application of the conversations following each of the book clubs is very much at an academy level, because whilst there will be consistency and equity is probably the best way to describe it in terms of what we aspire for our colleagues and for our children, the way that looks in each school will be different based on their context and their particular approaches to curriculum. For behaviour, for example, we've got some guiding principles around behaviour, around clarity, around high, clear expectations, around consistency. But the detail of the application for that will be nuanced, because it will be, contextual. It will be looking at ages and stages of the children. We serve primary and secondary communities, nursery right through to kind of key stage 4. So those guiding principles will absolutely remain consistent, but then, like I say, that application will be really nuanced. In terms of the book club itself, head teachers and schools are running it in different ways. So we've got some colleagues who were joining from one room, and they were kind of, sat spaced out with a cup of tea and a cake or whatever. We've got some who will revisit the recordings later on. We've got some who are building it in so that actually there'll be a key member of staff from the school will attend each of the sessions, and they'll feed back in their staff CPD sessions in a way that is kind of more accessible to them. We've got some really small primary schools who've got 3 or 4 members of staff, right through to, big 2, 3 form-entry primaries and a secondary. So it'll look different, but this is where I think the book club could be really powerful, because we'll have a common language we'll have some common models of excellence, and we'll be able to have those conversations and genuinely collaborate, not just communicate, because they're different. But the way it actually looks obviously will be different for each setting.
That makes a whole lot of sense, and it's definitely something I can get on board with in terms of, at the very start of thinking deeply about primary mathematics, I say, before you do this, get culture for behavior in place, and then come back to the book. Say you're an NQT reading the book, or an ECT, or your math subject lead. Your focus is on making sure the pupils are ready for the mathematics. So yeah, I can definitely see that as a really important takeaway. I think you guys have got a.
And I think it's often easy to say, isn't it? But I think I hope it's quite empowering for colleagues across the trust, where actually that's the message in every school, and across the executive team. It's a real core. It's almost empowering classroom teachers to take the time to stop, empowering leaders to take the time to stop if we need to, and if behaviour is the curriculum in itself for a few weeks, then that's where we need to be, and kind of leaders supporting teachers with that, and us supporting our school leaders with that. Yeah, everyone's responsibility.
Nice. So that's a really big takeaway. What was the second one?
So knowledge transfer is the second part in there. So the pedagogical approach is really underpinning that. And we spoke with Lekha about, there's an awful lot of noise, in inverted commas, around some of this at the minute, but actually that can only be a good thing, because it means everybody's talking about it. And I think sometimes we assume that just because we're well read, or we're on Twitter reading what's going on and what's being said, that everybody is, and they're not. Actually, that's the minority. So I think it's really important to kind of, that's another part of the rationale for getting these books into schools, is let's make this everybody's knowledge. Let's kind of have an equity around that. So Lekha talks about using the science of learning, using what we know well, using that careful consideration of cognitive load, practice and rehearsing the explanation of that new knowledge. How is it going to look? What are we deliberately directing children's attention to? And how do we have those conversations with colleagues? If we're lucky enough to have support staff in our classrooms regularly, how are we communicating that as part of our planning, as part of the prep? Lots of rehearsal, lots of modelling, and a real emphasis on the modelling and the normalising of error in this section, which I think was a real big takeaway for everybody, because sometimes you have the curse of the expert, and I think unless you really shine a spotlight on that, and really break down that content, we're at risk of asking just slightly too much of our children sometimes, I think. So I think that normalising and modelling of error, I think, was a big takeaway in there.
Well, that sounds really interesting. And so were they given, here's how you might make the most of errors in the classroom, that kind of situation?
Yeah, so there's a couple of really good examples in the chapter from Lekha around how to narrate that when modelling writing, for example, verbalising thought processes, verbalising the avoidance of error, but also having that culture of, actually, this is good because it means A, I'm not going to make that mistake again, B, I'm going to learn from it, and we're going to learn from that together. And I think it comes back to that culture we talked about with behaviour, is if that's right, actually the conversations around error and the sharing of errors, children feel safer to do that, and especially when it's modelled by their trusted adults, and some of the conversations around that. And also, planning with errors in mind, plan with those common misconceptions at the forefront, and actually let's tackle them head on and not wait for them to arise. Let's try and deliberately mitigate with that.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's two really big ones then. What about number 3?
Yeah. You see, it packs a punch, right? This is all across 2 or 3 pages. Assessment for learning and knowing your pupils, and shaping our children as academics as well as individuals, and actually holding both of those things at real high profile. So I think we talk, again, a lot of talk at the minute, isn't there, around assessment, and particularly assessment for learning. But what Lekha does brilliantly here is she just really strips it back to the basics. What do our children know? How do you know? And what do they need to know next? And it really is that simple. She'll talk about kind of on a minute by minute basis in the classroom, that mental note in your head as the class teacher: who does, who doesn't, where am I going to be, where do they need to be, and what do I do next? Right the way through to, the difference at the moment, perhaps particularly between the intended curriculum and the enacted curriculum, and talking about actually where we are making those changes, the importance of those assessment conversations between teachers and subject leaders and senior leaders, and how we might navigate that. But again, that use of misconceptions through that assessment for learning in the classroom, and using them from one day, 1 week, one half a term, one topic, whatever it is, to the next, and kind of weaving that through. So she talks, real simple strategies, just show me on whiteboards, and the power of that, and not underestimating that, and just keeping it simple at times, with that. Through to the use of quizzes, let's say at the end of a unit of work, how we then use that information when we revisit that later on. Where's the sticky knowledge, where's the knowledge that we thought was sticky but actually in a week or so wasn't quite so, and how do we kind of weave that back in to our common practice. But I think my big takeaway for that was, yes, we need a blueprint. Yes, there's got to be a sequence and a coherent plan. But actually, just keep it simple in daily classroom practice. Really kind of empowering our teachers to whatever is the best way for them and their children. The important aspect of that assessment for learning is, what do you know about your children and how are you going to use it?
I think that's really important, because if I think back to 2008 when I first started teaching my own class, and the message around AFL wasn't clear and it wasn't concise, and it quite often involved PP. What do you call those? APP grids, which is the exact opposite of what it actually should be. There wasn't. I think I was very lucky that I happened to be in a school where we understood what do we need the pupils to learn, how do we know, and then where are we going to next. Whereas I don't think in a lot of situations it's only been recently as the sort of the core message has been distilled out. Obviously I've got survivor bias, and it may not be the way I remember it, but I think that's really important.
And I think also, when we say, and where do we go next? Well, next might be revisiting something. Next isn't racing through curriculum content. And I think there's a real pertinent quote in this chapter that says purposeful pacey, not quick pacey. And I think they're totally different. And we can sometimes get that misconception across colleagues, can't we, when we talk about pace of a lesson? It doesn't mean speed. It means what is the most appropriate thing, and that where and when. So, and that was a real good conversation to have, particularly with some early career teachers joining us. Because I think that, again, it's about empowering folks to slow down. Because if that is the right pace, then that's a great pacey lesson.
Yeah, I think, I can't remember who it was, but someone tried to ban the word pace during the second TDaPE quiz. It feels like it's something Neil or Shannon might have tried to have banned, because they were allowed to take one piece of vocabulary away from education. I think, someone definitely chose it because, so misinterpreted for so long.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
Within the book, are we being signposted to places? Because I'm amazed that we're covering some really fundamental ideas in, like you said, in a short space of time. Where are we getting signposted to?
Yeah, so not necessarily further reading, although there's lots of that if you want to particularly find it within the book, but there are expert insights in each chapter. So not only is it, coming from Lekha's lived experience and expertise, so this chapter in particular, the expert insight at the end of this one is John Hutchinson. And he talks about his role as assistant head with Reach and the kind of curriculum foundations there. Lots of other signposting. So we've got Mark Enzer in here. We've got Oliver Caviglioli. We've got Mary Meyer. Lots and lots of expertise woven through. Jennifer Webb. So there's kind of Lekha's really, really concise summaries of every aspect, and then some kind of further expertise and signposting with each chapter.
Nice. And all you've got to do is look up those people you mentioned, and then you're getting those connections you want. You're thinking, okay, well, I'll read this and then I'll read that, and before you know it, you're down a rabbit hole.
And exactly that, but also woven throughout, there'll be signposts to key websites, for example, bringing things back to national curriculum all the time, because I think we so easily sometimes totally overlook, you talk to subject leaders, the principles and aims for that subject in the national curriculum. That's a great starting point. And we're looking. So lots of signposting and referencing, but not so as to distract you from those kind of core messages within each chapter, or to lose that real succinct summary each time.
Brilliant. Yeah, so hitting some big key markers. What's your fourth takeaway?
So the fourth section in here is making connections in this chapter, and talking around the kind of 3D-ness of that, if you like. So connecting across time. So last week we studied this week we're going to be doing this. Connections across subjects. So in science we looked at X. Today in geography we're going to be looking at Y, and there's a connection there. Or within subjects. So, you know, when we were learning about this period in history, we were looking at the traditions, and now we're learning about traditions of this period of time, and we're going to compare and contrast. So, and you know, the real importance, I think, for us as professionals as well as for our children, of making those connections really explicit, and making the most of them when they're meaningful, not forcing them when they're not. I think is a key one. But you know, knowledge breeds knowledge. So Lekha does a great job of explaining why we need to make those links really explicit, and you know how that can really help to build on that prior learning, and also help support colleagues in future year groups, you know, where we've kind of done that, and having that back to that intended and enacted curriculum. I think you covered this in year 3, but just a minor issue of a pandemic, did you? You know, because it's all right thinking you're going to revert to prior learning if actually it wasn't there. So no, real core concept there around that dialogue for us with our children, making that really explicit, but also the dialogue for us as colleagues.
I know lots of schools and school leaders who are having those particular conversations. You know, how do we make sure that we know that what is learned in year 2 impacts on what's learned in year 4?
Yeah.
And also, next week, what approach have you taken across your trust then in that sort of design idea and in
so
reality?
Lots of fantastic conversations happening at the moment with specific subjects. So again, you know, being part of a trust, you can bring colleagues together and talk about that. But actually, at school level, that's not always helpful, because for our history leaders, for example, what's happened in one school with the delivery of the history curriculum could be totally different to the enacted history curriculum in another setting. So just empowering colleagues to take this time to really genuinely ascertain where the children are, have those structured conversations around what we've been unable to cover at this point, but actually that's okay. Let's take the concept or the knowledge rather than the theme or the topic or whatever it might be, and let's be really intentional about whether that's a threshold concept, for want of a better phrase, or whether that vocabulary can be covered somewhere else. And how can we do that? But then building on prior and future learning, you know, colleagues have got some great strategies going on in terms of flashbacks, in terms of looking at what came before, what's going to come next, and actually where we think that knowledge hasn't stuck, what are we doing with it actually to deliberately revisit then over the next few weeks? Because actually it's committed to memory. It's just really hard to retrieve. It's there. You know, we just need to kind of build that retrieval strength. So lots of good conversations going on. And like I say, using this book in particular, when meeting with our colleagues who are new to subject leadership over the next couple of weeks. And I'm sure there'll be really, really helpful conversations in there as well.
Nice. Every time I ask someone about that, I'm really just sort of mining and farming their ideas so I can share them with people I work with in the real world. So always interested to hear.
We found Microsoft Forms really helpful, you know, for things like this. So not necessarily the difference between intended and enacted curriculum so much, although now you've started me thinking we could probably use it in that way. But looking at what was intended at the start of a unit of work, and then how the children have retained that, and just using the same quiz, you know, at the end of the topic, 4 weeks later, 6 weeks later. But then, like we've said with assessment for learning, what do you do with that? So what did they know after 4 weeks that they've forgotten after 8? And actually how you're going to deliberately build that into your retrieval in the morning, or however it might look, and prioritizing that, you know, if particular things are harder to retrieve but are less impactful on the rest of the curriculum, let's maybe save that for a while, and actually let's deliberately revisit the things that could be particular barrier moving forward.
Excellent. Sounds fantastic. And then what was the final takeaway?
So joy for learning was the final takeaway in that chapter, the final point. And I think it's really important. We had a great conversation around how engaged, exciting, buzzy classrooms can sometimes be a poor proxy for learning. But actually what they do tell you is that your children are happy, enjoying themselves, and they want to be there. So but Lekha talked a lot about that thirst for learning, and that back to that developing our children as scholars. Actually, if we've got that right, there's a real culture of learning, a culture of error, and it's celebrated, and there's a sense of positivity. There's that intrinsic motivation. You don't need, rewards are great and they're absolutely appropriate, but you don't necessarily need them for learning, because it just is part of the fabric. It's the culture. We're going to look at later on in the year, we'll be looking at Ethic of Excellence, which is a great book with Ron Berger, but that Sonia Thompson's doing an in-action version of. So we'll be looking at that and actually how powerful that is in classroom and school culture. And that's what Lekha's kind of portraying in that chapter, and modelling and showcasing the brilliance of the individual subjects, and having that real joy and thirst to learn more.
That's pretty topical, that one as well. We just recorded an episode on talk and how to get the most from it in the classroom. I think it's a couple of weeks away yet, but it's certainly something that people are engaged in the conversation around, aren't they?
Definitely. And I think, if you go back to the making connections, if we empower our children with the ability to articulate the connections that they can see, that's a really powerful strategy. And we know the importance of RSC at the moment, but I think you can weave that through absolutely every aspect of our work, can't we?
Absolutely. So I can totally see why you chose this chapter. 5 big takeaways. Let's test my working memory. So we've got behavior for learning.
Yeah.
We've got assessment for learning. I know there was one before assessment for learning. We've got the connections. It was misconceptions.
It was so knowledge transfer. So the actual pedagogy, the approaches in the classroom. Yeah.
And then joy of learning. And those 5 things are what help you to take that intended curriculum and make it something that's meaningful to children. Am I interpreting the chapter the right way?
Yeah, and for us as an organisation, it helps us codify what we mean when we talk about really effective curriculum implementation. And that's brilliant, because it means, like I said earlier, that's the difference really between our colleagues communicating and our colleagues genuinely collaborating, because there's that common language and understanding now around what exactly do we mean by that.
Nice. I think the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try and get my hands on a copy, whether it be in school or digitally, because everything you're saying, I think this is a book that'll be really useful for many colleagues in many different situations.
Absolutely. Yeah. And those expert insights at the end are great, because you kind of get in those case study type examples then of how things look in schools. And as I say, it's John Hutchinson's in this chapter.
So how else will the book be used across your trust?
So we're going to weave it into, it will be the main core text in our new to subject leadership session. So we've got 3 or 4 of those throughout the year. So I'm just this week actually looking at the first set of those, and I'm using the curriculum principles and the intent and infrastructure chapters for that. So the chapters 1 and 2. But then I'll continue to use them throughout. So I'm going to use implementation and the inclusive classroom in our second chunk of sessions for those colleagues, and then curriculum evaluation and continuous improvement towards the end of the year. And again, to know then that all of our schools have got the book in the staff room, but actually everybody's having some real good structured conversations on particular aspects of it. It just means that there are those common models across, and it'll also feed into subject leader conversations when we're looking at school to school support, when we're looking at our school improvement colleagues going in and supporting. There's a reference point throughout the year. We might be able to be saying to colleagues, do you remember such and such a part in this book, or you could support them with that aspect of it. Really looking forward to using the inclusive classroom chapter, and I think we'll probably find that in our other CPD groups, so English and Maths leaders, for example, we've got a Senko group, we've got an early career teacher group, obviously we've got recently qualified teacher group. I think that one will probably prove quite a frequently used one.
Nice. It sounds like you've got all the ingredients for a really successful sort of CPD program this year, which is obviously one of the reasons why I was keen to
Yeah.
hear about it as much as possible. I think I'll share some of the things that are happening soon, while give people a chance if they want to ask any questions. They may not, chat might not be the most natural thing for them. They may not be watching. Who knows? But let me just get my captions. So I think the next time that we're together, Amy, it will be on the 10th of November.
Yeah, we will. Very excited for that.
We got CPAL Part 1.
Yeah, it's a half decent book, I've heard.
And we're back on GMT then, I think, because I think next Sunday or on Sunday, clocks go back or forward. Who knows?
Yeah.
So 8 p.m. GMT. We've on Wednesday, 10th November. And then we have got the Marge Model of Learning by Nimish Lads, 24th of November. Between now and then, he's going to be doing a book club with your teachers as well. Is that right?
He is, yeah. So he's joining us the week before that, I think it is. So we'll all be looking through that. And I love this book because this is I remember the first conference that I went to with Tom Sherrington, when kind of had that first wave of real high quality training on Rosenshine's principles. And this is kind of that first half an hour of that conference is real centered on the Marge Model of Learning. So when Nimish did this, I was highly delighted because I think it's a real good way in, actually pre Rosenshine's principles.
Excellent. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and read as many of these books as possible before you guys have your book club. And I think I'll maybe start there with that one. And then Neil Almond, who's always on the podcast, is doing 2 sessions on Friday. I'm not sure what he's thinking, although he's had 2 weeks off. So he's probably ready to go back to work. And I know that on Friday at midday, could be via this channel. He could have his own channel by then. He's going to do everything teachers need to know about reading and comprehension. Saw this at Research Ed Surrey, and it was phenomenal. And particularly the secondary teachers, because there was a 50-50 split. They were writing down everything he said during this session. So primary or secondary, do not miss this.
Yeah, and he wrote something about this, tweeted something earlier on today about this, and I tagged a colleague who I worked with in my previous role at Academy Transformation Trust, who's a secondary lead, kind of said this. Remember all that we were talking about? Here it is. So great stuff in there. Yeah.
And then at 2:30, he's lost his mind. Curriculum coherence, why now? How best to do it? Again on Friday, 2:30 p.m. Neil is quite often the go-to on matters of curriculum, certainly with his box set analogy, and I've seen that talk a few times. Not sure if I've seen this one precisely, but I reckon, well worth checking out as well. Fantastic. So all that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me, Amy.
Thank you for the invite again.
To everyone at home, until next time, thanks for watching. We'll try the theme tune again, actually. Yeah, so let's see. So I'll make us disappear.